state your full name and your year of birth to start out with.
William A. Sikkel, S-I-K-K-E-L. And if you wait just 2 weeks, I'll be 85, 25th of November.
What was your rank during World War II?
Beginning or end?
Both.
I started out as a private, went through the enlisted ranks up through staff sergeant, and then had a commission as a second lieutenant in Australia. Came home a captain and reorganized the Holland National Guard unit and retired as a lieutenant colonel.
I think we have some of the same background questions, so I'll go ahead if you don't mind. When did you join the National Guard?
On my 18th birthday.
Why?
Well, I had an uncle that was in prior to that time, and I kind of idolized him. I had a dad who was a World War I veteran who was a Dutch immigrant, and he was red, white, and blue, and things like Memorial Day and any holiday was sacred. So I guess it was ingrained. And then I, for some reason or other, just took a liking to the concept of leadership, group organization, and that pretty much motivated me to join. And I imagine the tail end of the Depression is a few extra dollars. That must have factored into it sooner or later. My dear personal preference would have been to fly, but once in the infantry, you're in the infantry.
Had you ever traveled outside of West Michigan before you had joined the service?
Before, outside of a few trips to Chicago, I remember a group of young men took a group of us kids to a Tiger game in Detroit and then had us cross the Ambassador Bridge into Canada, and that was a biggie. Other than that, no, pretty much restricted to the Midwest.
When you joined the 32nd and the 126th Division, did you understand the history of that division?
Not the division. I understood the history of the local unit, but at that particular point in my life, that was pretty much it. I knew somewhat of the structure in terms of Western Michigan being pretty much anchored in Grand Rapids, the 126th Infantry headquarters. But no, at that point in my career, I stuck with the basics, and that was my local unit.
How many of the other 126 Company D did you know personally before you went to Louisiana?
Out of 80, I would suggest that I was quite familiar with at least 50 that I would consider I knew quite well. There were several that were considerably older than me, and we didn't have a lot in common, plus the fact that most of them had a significant amount of rank, and so I was just a lowly private, and you didn't get to be too familiar with sergeants in those days.
Next question is, how did Holland send you off when you were going down to Louisiana?
Well, the word is you there, and I have to qualify that for this reason.
I meant you plural.
No, I understand, because we left the city in October 25 of 1940. There were, I don't remember exactly how many, but I'm guessing close to 6 of us who were sent early that day. One drove the unit commander's car, another one happened to be, eventually became my brother-in-law, drove his car down. My first sergeant drove down and with his wife, and we were asked to drive someone's car down. So the 6 of us left in the morning. The rest left that evening from the railroad station, and your question was the community, as I recall the question. And let's put it this way, enthusiastic, emotional support from the time the unit marched out of the armory right to the depot and boarded a train. And that, of course, is all information that I received from my buddies once we joined each other in Louisiana.
What were your, I guess, fears or perhaps questions that you had as you were leaving?
You know, that's a good question, and in retrospect, I'm not trying to suggest that I was more adventuresome than most, but I must have felt a challenge. So outside of the basic homesickness, I just saw it as an opportunity, and when you go with a group that you know so well, it makes it so much easier. You knew the communication was going to continue once we got there, and that pretty much alleviated any anxiety. And quite frankly, from a very personal perspective, I must have seen a challenge because I had a dad who was a perfectionist. I had a very difficult time pleasing him, and that doesn't mean I didn't respect him. I just had a difficult time appealing to what he was trying to make me, and I knew there was no possibility that we were going to be on the same page or the same network, and that contributed somewhat because it gave me a comfort zone, and I had to prove something to myself.
Where were you when you heard about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor?
I was, quite frankly, having dinner with a wonderful family in Alexandria, Louisiana. We were treated extremely well down there, and many of us met many wonderful families who invited us for dinner frequently. And it happened to be a family that invited me to dinner that particular noon, and I was there at their home when we heard it on the radio.
What was your initial reaction to that?
Better get back to camp. I happened to have, at that time, I think I was a staff sergeant, and I was privileged to have what we call a recon car, reconnaissance car, which is a military vehicle. And I was smart enough to know that I better get back to camp with that. So that's exactly what I did. And obviously, your next question could be, what did you experience when you got back to camp? And I'd be happy to answer that question.
Yeah, in terms of training or preparation that they, prepared, how did your training or experiences in Louisiana prepare you for the South Pacific?
It didn't. It didn't. All of our training up to that point was training for what we call open warfare. By that I mean typical Michigan terrain, hills, valleys, woods, open fields, rivers. That's what we were trained for. We didn't have a clue of what a jungle was like. So, and sooner or later you may ask the question, where did you go from Louisiana? And that'll qualify somewhat the answer that I'm giving you right now. So outside of the fact that we did a lot of training on our individual weapons, like pistols, rifles, mortars, and the typical infantry training like chemical warfare and cover and concealment, camouflage, anti-tank defense, all those little things, communication. Those are the things that we were taught, and most of that you could use regardless of where you went.
In terms of your training, did you use live ammunition during practice and drills, or was it other forms?
Well, if you've interviewed many who were in active duty that early, you probably have been told that we faked a lot in those days, and by that I mean we didn't even have weapons. So if we didn't have weapons, obviously we didn't have ammunition. And so, for example, in my case, by that time I was in the 81 millimeter mortar platoon. We used fence posts to simulate what an 81 millimeter mortar would do. Now, obviously, you can't shoot out of a fence post, but what you can do is learn the tactical employment of a mortar, because the basic principles are lob it up and lob it in. So the angle of the fence post would be proportionate to what the angle of the mortar should be. And the reason that's significant is because a mortar person selects a totally different kind of terrain than an artilleryman would be, for example, because a mortar goes up and over where an artillery shell goes flat. Therefore, you have to hide behind a hill and shoot over it. That's the ideal situation.
When you were in Louisiana, did you have any funny or strange things that happened in camp there that you remember?
Lots of them. And some are cultural, some are climatic. Cultural be obvious. A bunch of Yankees out of Holland, Michigan, placed in Louisiana, where, let's remember, it was 1940, and there were still people thinking Civil War down there, and we were, in the eyes and minds of a lot of people, damn Yankees. So I recognized early on that there were essentially two types of Southerners. There were the rebel Southerners, and there were the Southern genteel. And those Southern gentlemen and ladies were really a fine bunch of people. And they made us feel very welcome. That's the first observation. The second one, the climatic, going to a football game on Thanksgiving Day in sweatshirt and T-shirts and umbrellas was totally foreign to me because, you know, you button up pretty good when you go to a football game in November here, generally speaking. Then, of course, the terrain. If you've ever spent any time in the boonies in Louisiana, you know you've heard about red clay, and we had a cliche which went something like this: that Louisiana is the only place where you can be up to your rear in mud and dust in your eyes, and essentially that's the way it is. And when that mud cakes on your shoes, you're carrying an extra few pounds around. So that translates into where we lived, and we lived in a tent city because there certainly weren't enough quarters for the rapid expansion of troops. So the only permanent buildings were the mess hall where the food was prepared, and that happened to have a sand floor, and the latrine or the bathhouse at the end of the street, and in between were tents and floorboards, wooden floorboards, and a stove that burned wood. So the funny part of it is that it was not unusual to come in from field training and find 2 or 3 tents gone because the sparks would ignite on a tent, and that was the end of the tent. And I could go on and on about some of the weird things that happened. I'll just give you one quick one. We had been given a course by the doctor on what to be careful of, such as tarantulas. You always move the leaves out of the way, and then you sit for a class or whatever, and would you believe I sat right on a tarantula? A scorpion, scorpion. And needless to say, the doctor was right there, so I had first aid right now, but it's a little humorous. That's a practical explanation of what first aid is, but I never planned it that way.
Kind of 2 questions in one. Did you receive any sort of shots before you left in terms of preparation? And secondly, did you realize that during your training you would be sent to the South Pacific?
No, we didn't have a clue we were going to the Pacific. Shots, yes. In fact, I realize that some of us older people have a crummy sense of humor, but it's not unusual for a veteran to call a nurse a bloodsucker. Maybe you've heard that before, but we've had our blood tested so often and so many shots that it just gets to be routine. And back in those days particularly, because now you get on an airplane and you fly to another country and you don't even get immunized, you don't get segregated when you get there. Back in those days, one way to control disease was, number 1, shots, and number 2, wherever we went into isolation for at least 3 days until we acclimated to the country we were in, or location we were in. Were there 2 questions there, or did I get them both?
You got them both.
Good.
Switch up a little bit here. Tell us about San Francisco. How did you get there, and what was it like when you got there?
Would you mind if I went to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, before we get to San Francisco?
That'd be fine.
There's a reason for that. The Michigan and Wisconsin National Guard were the 32nd Division. We were sent to Louisiana, obviously, to train in the event. And during that alleged 1 year, it was extended considerably. Therefore, in I think March of '42, we were sent to Fort Devens, Massachusetts. The obvious question is, you went to Australia and New Guinea, what are you doing in Massachusetts? And the answer was that our division was to replace the 1st Division, who were at Fort Devens, Massachusetts at the time, the big red one you heard about. And we were destined, I understand, for Ireland as a staging area. If you read history about Bataan and Corregidor and General MacArthur's situation at that time, he was promised an army in Australia by President Roosevelt. Therefore, we were diverted from Devens, Massachusetts to San Francisco. And we didn't know where we were going, except we went to San Francisco. And incidentally, my dad died that week, and so I hitchhiked with the 127th Infantry out of Wisconsin, and ended up in California and boarded ship about 6 hours before we left. But nevertheless, we didn't have a clue where we were going, except that obviously we weren't going to Europe.
Had you heard anything on board ship, any rumors or any sort of reports about where you were going and what it was like or anything of that sort?
We weren't told anything and I've got a short diary at home, but I think it was the 4th day out of San Francisco when they finally told us where we were going. And there were 2 reasons. One is to satisfy our curiosity and put a stop to the rumors. And the other was that's when they began our little lectures on the cultural difference between Australia and America. And you wouldn't think there were that many cultural differences, but even their slang language is totally different than ours, and there are several things that are different, so we were prepared to understand what we were getting into once we got to Australia. Where in Australia was a clue, and could be a follow-up question there. Did you go where you were intended to, or did you go someplace else? And I don't know, I sent you some suggestions, so I don't know whether you want to get into that now or later.
Probably later, because I think she's got a few that touch on Australia also. Do you have any Australia questions?
In terms of the transports over, what was the experience like that waiting?
Good question. And the reason it's a good question is that the use of what we're doing right now is such that we're trying to convey, and you are trying to convey, the difference between transportation then and now. If you were to watch television tonight, you'd probably see someone getting on an airplane and flying off to Iraq or someplace. Number one, we went from the East Coast to the West Coast on a train. That in itself is totally different than hopping on an airplane and flying over to San Francisco and then getting on another airplane. The second thing was getting on a ship, because that's the way troops were shipped in those days. And in our case, a whole division, which at that time was, a triangle division, 9,000, 9,600, somewhere in that area, all in one convoy with freighters. So that's a slow way, and slow because of 2 things. Number one, we had, I think, 14 ships in our convoy, and we could only go as fast as the slowest freighter. So even though we were on the so-called flagship of the Matson Line, the Lurleen, which had a sister ship, Matsonia, we could only go as slow as the slowest freighter, which I think was something like 14 knots. So that plus zigzagging, it took us 25 days to get from San Francisco to South Australia. And the reason for South Australia, I might share with you right now, is we were headed for Brisbane, which is on the northeast quarter. However, while we were in the timeline on that map that I showed you earlier, the timeline would suggest that the Coral Sea battle was taking place off to the north while our convoy was headed for Australia. So since we had, I don't recall at that point having any naval escort, 14 ships and no Navy escort, because they're all committed to the Coral Sea battle, and we could see the flashes in the distance. And about that time, and this is all speculation, this is not gospel, the speculation that we all seem to agree with is that at that point we were diverted to South Australia rather than Brisbane, because Brisbane would have been right in line with chaos. So we went to South Australia, which is considerably further away.
Tell us about the King Neptune ceremony.
That's a Navy tradition. When you cross the equator, funny things happen. And I don't know whether it's a get even time where the cocky characters and need a little extra trimming or what, I don't know. I was pretty lucky. I just got thrown in a pool. But there were those who were, shall I say, you probably heard about high school freshmen or college freshmen. That's the kind of treatment they got, and some of it was pretty raunchy. But after it was all over with, you were given a certificate of having been honored by King Neptune and crossed the equator in such and such a date. Which brings up an interesting point, and that is my wife's brother at that time was a high school buddy of mine, and two other fellows did a lot of singing. And one way to keep from getting seasick was to get up on deck. So we'd get up there and sing as a quartet just for the fun. And we slept on deck one night, and when we woke up in the morning, we didn't have anything in our pockets. Somebody stripped our pockets, and including the certificate I received for King Neptune. So I have never had one since. I do not have any indelible proof that I went across the equator.
Did you carry any personal items with you on your trip over?
The few dollars we had, and our personal luggage, of course, was in what we call a GI bag. What do you call those? Bag with all our clothes and whatever, and that was it. Personal stuff, no. Do you want a little humor interspersed into this, or not necessarily?
Of course.
We had a first sergeant who lived in Holland, who was about what I would call the epitome of what a soldier should be. By that I mean he knew what he was doing. He was a fatherly figure. He was considerably older than most of us. Very kind, judgmental, fair-minded individual. And he only twice in my personal experience with him, that he violated the law, the rules, and I was with him both times this happened. The first time was he had this barracks bag, is what I'm looking for, over his shoulder, and he was walking off the gangplank into the ship. And he got about the first flight down, and he lost his barracks bag, and on the bottom was a bottle of scotch. And he sobbed over that bottle of scotch because they weren't supposed to do that. But anyway, personal stuff, he had a personal bottle of scotch.
Was that Gerds? Was that Gerds?
Name?
Yeah.
The individual?
Yeah. Was
No,
that Gerds
Van Anroy.
Oh, okay.
Gord may have talked about Sergeant Van Anroy,
Yeah.
our first sergeant.
Okay. I was thinking of someone else. So now on to Australia, I think, unless you have any more about transfer. What was your first impression of the Australian soldiers?
May I digress just a minute here, because I'm trying to throw in what I consider significant. If you don't
That's
want me
fine.
to do that, let me know. When we left San Francisco, we were told all about the peaceful Pacific. Well, as Gord may have shared with you, within an hour out of San Francisco, the seasickness set in. Imagine 7,400 troops on one ship. 7,400 troops. And once that starts, it gets contagious. And so much for that. I don't want to go any further than that. Then we went between Tasmania and Australia, and we were in the wildest sea you ever saw. And this is a huge ship. And to this day, since I used to love to skate, I've often thought, wouldn't it have been wonderful I had roller skates, because when the stern came up, you just go down the hall, and then when it flipped around, you just turn around and go back. You could do that all day long. Anyway, I didn't get seasick. Now, the question, I ducked the question.
your impression of the Australian soldiers when you get to Australia?
Well, the Australian people were wonderful people, and I realized this a lot of years ago, but Gord was there a couple of years ago, as he probably shared with you. Anytime I see or hear or talk to anyone who's been there recently, I want to talk to them because I want to find out whether my memories are the same as what they are today. And I have yet to run into a person who doesn't love the Australians. They as individuals and the Australian soldiers, that was an interesting case, in that not only, if you've watched British television or BBC, the Brits have a style of humor that is so dry. The Aussies are like that, very much like that. But when you consider who we fought with in New Guinea, we fought with Australian soldiers who had been in Libya, Syria, Crete, Egypt, hadn't been home, went straight from Libya and Crete right to New Guinea without even having a chance. Can you imagine? And so they had not only did they have a typical Australian British sense to life, but they also had a devil-may-care attitude. And let me qualify that. The American Army, we were trained sound discipline, light discipline, to the point where it was just gospel with us. We would even tape our dog tags so we didn't make noise while we were on patrol. Those Australians, if it came 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they could care less where they were, under what situation. You've heard of billy cans? They had to boil their tea, which violated 2 principles that we were taught. Number one, the noise. How do you boil in a tin can? How do you boil tea without making noise? Number 2, how can you conceal your location by building a fire? I mean, and that just scare us. Like we would avoid them at that time because they could care less. Now, I often wondered whether it was their makeup or whether it was because they'd been in battle so long they didn't care. I don't know what the answer to that is, but they're wonderful people.
What training did you receive in Australia, if any?
Pretty much the same as what we had in Louisiana and in Fort Devens, Massachusetts. We were still, for some silly reason or other, being trained for what we call open warfare. And I'm convinced that a lot of our leaders didn't have a clue of what jungle warfare was like. And if they did, it took us quite a while to really learn all the nuances, because just for example, coral shells, coral hard pan is something we didn't have a clue of, and I'll expand that a little bit. By this time, I was a second lieutenant, and in the pre-World War II Army, a second lieutenant was pretty hot stuff. You had a GI to do all your grunt work for you. And that particular night, the very first night we were in New Guinea, we were bombed, and we had been told to dig foxholes. And I figured, well, I'm a lieutenant, somebody will do it for me. Until the first or second bombing, and there was a lieutenant colonel with a pickaxe digging a hole in the shale. And I thought, well, if he can do it, I guess I have to do it too. But the answer to that is, how do you make a foxhole deep enough in shale, rock, and coral to protect yourself? That's the first lesson in tropical warfare. The second is obvious, and that is, well, in addition to climate, rain, and mosquitoes and everything else. But jungle foliage is so thick that unless you see it on television, it's pretty difficult to explain. In fact, it's almost unbelievable when you do try to explain it. And you may or may not get into the story about the airplane that I lost. You know, you asked the question, why 16 years? Well, I can give you an answer to that. Go ahead.
Kind of jumping back, what were your experiences leaving Australia in terms of how did you reach the island?
Except for the unit that Gord was with, Gord Zuvrink we're talking about, who you interviewed before, the 2nd Battalion, 126th Infantry, which was comprised of 2 units in Muskegon, Grand Haven, and Big Rapids. They were flown to New Guinea, as was, I think, Gord's unit, Cannon Company, I'm almost certain he was, anti-tank company of the 126th. The rest of us went by ship from Brisbane, Australia. And again, I don't know when you want to cut this off, but I think this is significant in terms of what I call logistics. When we left Adelaide, Australia to go to Brisbane, Australia, we loaded everything on flat cars and box cars. And at that time, Australia had 3 railroad gauges. Now, maybe you heard this before, or maybe you didn't. We got to about Melbourne and take everything off the train and reload it on another train because they had a different gauge. And then we get, I don't know whether we were beyond Sydney or where, but we got into the 3rd gauge and took everything off the train and put it back on the next train. And then, so that's and that plus the passenger cars, which were rather antiquated. Did that answer your question?
On to New Guinea. Did you understand the mission before you, as you left Australia?
We did because things were crucial at that point. The obvious question was, what are we doing over here when we were supposed to be going to Europe? And the answer is obvious. President Roosevelt had promised MacArthur troops, and there weren't any outside the Australians. And so they sent the 32nd Division from the East Coast. And right behind us was the 41st Division, who replaced us in New Guinea. So that would give you roughly 18,000, roughly 19,000 troops, 2 divisions. And then the Marines, of course, the 1st Marines were there. They went to Guadalcanal. So we were it as far as New Guinea is concerned. When we left Port Moresby, the Japanese were 25 miles roughly from Port Moresby. When we left Australia to go to Port Moresby, the Japanese were roughly 25 miles from Port Moresby. The significance of that is, number one, it was on the forward slope of the mountain facing Australia. Number 2, there were 2 airstrips there, which would have given them the capability of taking off with their bombers and fighters to fly in over Australia. And whether or not you've ever been involved in history to the degree that I'm going to share with you, the Australian government at that time had predetermined that they were willing to give up a portion of their country for battleground. And therefore, there was a line established from east to west, and you've heard of the Maginot Line and the Siegfried Line in Europe. This was the Brisbane Line. And the Brisbane Line was an arbitrary line across the country that if the Japanese landed on north, like in Darwin, then this is where we'd put up our defense. Well, it didn't get to that point. They did bomb Darwin, but no one landed in Australia. We landed in Port Moresby, New Guinea, as did the Australian cavalry in that case, and chased the Japanese back over the mountain toward what became the Buna Campaign. So that again precipitates a lot of questions. And the first question is, what kind of training do you have? Well, we didn't have much training because, as it turned out, in addition to trying to live under tropical conditions, we immediately were hit with amoebic dysentery, immediately. Plus, if you follow the field manual on leadership, you find that there's such a thing as a staging area, and then there's a departure area, and then there's a final line of departure, and then you go into combat. Well, there wasn't such a thing in Port Moresby. Port Moresby was the port, and within 3 miles you were climbing mountains, and so there was no place to train. So that was it. The disease hit us before we ever started up the mountains, and then Gord's unit, as you know by that interview, they took, I think, 34 days from Port Moresby all the way across the mountain and chased the Japanese all the way with the Australians. And they took one route, and then we started on, well, in our case, the November 10, the airplane incident that you might want to be talking about. And we chased the Japanese the rest of the way to what became the Buna Campaign. And the reason it became the Buna Campaign is that we we compressed them to a point and then they wouldn't give. And so that's why it took us so long to get to the sea.
You mentioned a little bit about the diseases that you guys had to face in the jungle terrain itself. How did you deal with morale at that time? Was there a loss of morale amongst the men?
Not at this point. Not at this point. Weakness, but not, no. I don't think I don't remember any loss of morale until we start seeing our friends being killed. Then the morale changed. And even then, kept on going, because it's amazing how you condition your mind under situations like that. Most, not all, most do.
So tell us a little bit about what happened on the airplane. Were you aboard the airplane?
I was, well, that's an interesting question or story, and it's a story in itself. We were involved, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 126th Infantry, were involved with the first airlift into a combat zone in the history of the U.S. Army. The group that Mr. Zubrink was with went up the mountains in advance of us, and they, along with the natives, I'm sure, because I never did find out officially how this happened, but there was a flat area in a native village called Pangani, which was on the side of the mountain, and they had to take their machetes and chop grass until it was smooth enough for us to land. So each officer, there had to be an officer on each airplane. I was assigned 2 airplanes because my platoon couldn't possibly fit in one. Plus there were some additional troops for other reasons that happened to be on those 2 airplanes. One airplane was called the Flying Dutchman. And since I'm from Holland, obviously, and the pilot was of Dutch extraction, American but Dutch extraction, I just made up my mind that I'd fly in the Flying Dutchman. The other was the Golden 8 Ball. And the chaplain and I were standing side by side, and I said, "Chaplain, I think I'm going to go on the Flying Dutchman." And he said, "Why don't we flip a coin?" Which we did, and he went on the Flying Dutchman, and I went on the Golden 8 Ball. And the Flying Dutchman crashed about a half an hour after they were airborne into the jungles. And I don't think Gord may have spent any time on that because he was way beyond that point. But anyway, there's a very, very in-depth story about that you can embellish at a later date if you want. But out of the, I think, original 29, including the crew, there were eventually 6 survivors in 2 groups. One group of 4, which included my platoon sergeant out of Jamestown, Michigan, and 2 that included, I think, the crew chief of the airplane. The rest either were killed on impact or had broken arms and legs. A couple of them went looking for water or some semblance of a trail and never were heard from again. Those who did stay near the airplane died one at a time. And they kept a diary on the inside of the door of that airplane, which had burned in the fire. And that first entrance was November 10, which was the day of our operation. And the last entrance was January 1. And for your information, that door is on display at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio now. In fact, I tried to get it to Holland Memorial Day because I was a speaker there, and I thought it'd be ideal to get it at the museum, but even our U.S. congressman couldn't get him to part with it. So I would encourage anyone who ever does go there to be sure to look it up. It's on a table encased in glass, and there's a printed diary, and I have a copy of the diary myself. Plus, I have a diary of my platoon sergeant who land navigated for, I think I sent you a copy of the story of he and I in the newspaper. He took the compass out of the dash of the airplane, and he and 5 others land navigated for 30 days over the mountains until we were finally intercepted by some friendly natives and brought back to Port Moresby. So that's incredible. And the obvious question is, why did it take 16 years to find that airplane? Jerry Ford, former President Ford, was our congressman at the time, and I was I don't know what I was, a major, lieutenant colonel, excuse me, National Guard. And so I had written him, and I said, if you hear of any airplanes that are found, because I was reading about it, name such and such, contact me. And it wasn't a few days later, the AP called me and said that airplane's been found. Now, this is 16 years after it went down. 21 years after it went down, another research team went in and found the airplane, took the door off, and brought it to the museum of Papua New Guinea, which was unheard of when we were there, a museum. But they did, and they in turn gave it to the U.S. Air Force. So that's an interesting story, and it's a tragic story, but it's how they land navigated through that jungle that many days. And the interesting thing is, by the time that Ed, my platoon sergeant, finally did get back to Port Moresby, I had been pretty much clobbered with malaria, and I'm laying in a hospital bed looking out of the window in Moresby, and he walks by. So needless to say, having been his platoon commander, I had to send missing in action envelopes back to his wife all that time. And I said, Ed, get to a cablegram as fast as you can and let your wife know where you are. He hadn't even gotten malaria by that time. I just can't imagine that. 83% of us did, and he hadn't gotten malaria at that time. That's a long way from the airplane ride, but it did save. In our case, we only had to walk 11 days over the mountains, where Gordon and that group walked 34 days. So it did save us a lot of time, but it's still rough.
Can you describe your first experience with the enemy or in a combat situation?
Yeah, I'm going to proceed with caution here, because the last thing you want is some of the things we really experienced, and you're not going to hear that from very many people. I will tell you this, that psychologically, to adjust to what you might run into that's a work in progress, as a cliche today. Coming down the mountain, well, do you have in your notes the airplane story about shooting down the Japanese Zero? Okay, I've got to inject that, because we're coming down the mountain now and we're heading into combat. And we had been given absolute instructions, no fires, do not give your position away. Japanese are going to be looking for you. They know you're up in the mountains, so don't shoot at any airplanes. We were on the forward slope of a mountain, and by that time, this one Japanese Zero was harassing us to the point where someone couldn't take it any longer. And he had a clear shot with his rifle of this airplane coming right straight at us, right down the valley. And he fired off a round. Now, the hilarious part of it is that he must have hit the gas line, because that airplane went down in flames right now. Seconds. So if he was up there to try to find out where we were and radio back, he'd never had a chance. But you would think you were at the U of M football game, hearing those guys cheer. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. Okay, that's our first close combat experience. Although we'd been bombed frequently back in Port Moresby, harassed. Getting into combat, we're coming down the mountain, and you could start hearing the rifle shots and the machine gun shots, and you know what that is. I mean, we knew what that was. That's when it starts getting real. And then you start working yourself into, excuse me, I hope that doesn't come too loud on here. Then it gets real. The very first observation we made is this, that Japanese, as you must have heard many times, had a way of, well, let me put it this way. If you're on the offense and they're on the defense, and they had a series of defensive positions coming down the mountain, pre-planned, and that's an interesting story in itself. And if you want to get back to it, why we didn't use their locations, and there's a good answer for that. But anyway, once we compress them against the sea, we're not going anyplace very fast. They know we're coming. They've had lots of time to dig in and under coconut logs and bunkers, and you've heard all that. I'm sure you've heard or read that. They had their fire lanes, and by fire lanes I mean that machine guns are taught to cross like this so that if you're going to get somebody sooner or later, both this way, but when you're in grass that's 6, 8 feet high and you're trying to get through it, you don't have a clue when you're going to be able to get through without being detected. So the Japanese would have fire lanes pre-planned, so if anybody exposed themselves, all they had to do was pull the trigger, and so you had to find out where those were. The way they operated, they were up in coconut trees, and they were observing, and so they would telegraph who was coming, where they were, and that sort of thing. So the very first casualty I saw, the first Japanese casualty I saw, which really set the tone of our attitude, because remember, killing is something that you're trained not to do. The very first person that got shot out of a tree right outside of our headquarters was a Japanese captain. And he had a saber with him. He came out of that tree and he landed right in front of us. And so we went through his pockets and checked to get military information as fast as we could. Would you believe the very first picture I saw was USC, University of Southern California. I mean, that's a turnoff if there ever was one. And you'd think that, having been in this country, that in itself would have been enough to keep him from doing it. Nevertheless, that was the first one. The first experience I had taken out of patrol, and I'll qualify that in a moment, when I was commissioned in Australia, just before going to New Guinea, my assignment was to command a anti-tank platoon. Well, whoop-de-doo, there are no tanks in New Guinea, and there are no tanks to shoot at. So what do they do with me? Well, they made me a patrol leader, and that's not conducive to good health, because you never know where you're going to go, and you're generally in some area that you would prefer not to be. Very first patrol I took out, and to this day I don't understand, with all that tension, why we had so much self-control. There was you have to understand, you don't have to understand, but you should understand that the average trail was no wider than this table, and the rest is foliage. And we were at a curve in a trail, and here come a string of Orientals. Now, I don't know about you, but to this day I have a tough time determining who's Japanese, who's Chinese, in some cases who's Filipino. So when you're in that kind of situation with that tension, and something like that happens, what do you do? And for some unknown reason or other, I said, don't shoot. And this guy held up, in humor and uniform, the guy held up his hands and he said, don't shoot. Me no Japan boy, me China boy. And he must have had 14, 15 with him. Now, the Japanese used the Chinese as coolies to do their grunt work, and so they carried all their stuff. Like we used the New Guinea natives to carry our radios and rice and all that stuff. So, needless to say, if you know anything about the value of military intelligence, if you did capture a Japanese soldier, there's no way you're going to get any information. No way. If they were alive, and they wouldn't let themselves live if they could do anything about it. But these Chinese boys were obviously a good source of intelligence. So I sent them back to our intelligence people, and they interrogated them, and I'm sure they learned a lot. But beyond that, a question that anybody would like to ask is, did you kill anyone personally? How many did you, and all that sort of thing. And I'm not going to go there, but I will say this, that one of the peculiarities of jungle warfare is that if the average person knew, the average American knew how many Japanese they killed, they'd be astonished. And the reason is that we had a fire against sound. Most of the time we didn't see them. I'll give you one example, and this is later on. This is just about the time when we broke through, we penetrated through. My experience was heavy weapons, machine guns, mortars, and that sort of thing. There was a captain out of Grand Rapids by the name of Russ Wildey, who was a heavy weapons unit commander. And he and I got along just famously well for a lot of reasons, but one reason was that he and I understood heavy weapons. But when we were in combat, we were at the mercy of ammunition that was kicked out of airplanes. We had no other supply. We didn't have a vehicle, nothing. So you can about imagine what ammunition looks like when it's kicked out of an airplane that's flying like this, and food, incidentally. That's a story in itself. But anyway, we salvaged as much as we could of 81 millimeter mortar rounds, and then we stacked, as I recall, 3 mortars side by side, maybe arm's length apart, and the Japanese were very predictable. I said, for example, that they, as they went down the mountain, they had a what I would call a headquarters base along the trail. They figured that those lazy Yankees will just use our base. We didn't. We went across the trail, and without question, the Japanese Navy would shell where they had been, assuming we were there, and we were just across the trail. Very predictable. They always left stacks of rice and stacks of sake and a lot of other stuff which indicated they weren't in too healthy a condition. We didn't touch any rice. We didn't touch any sake, period, for either could have been poisoned or it could have been booby-trapped. We don't know, but we left it alone. But anyway, this captain and I got our heads together one day, and we decided that since the Japanese had a tendency to get drunk on sake, if you left them alone long enough, we would let them do that, and then we would meanwhile stockpile any ammo we could get. And then when they decided to get drunk, we just poured it to them. And you'd leave them alone for a couple weeks, and they'd do the same thing. That's how we won the war. And incidentally, I think I sent you a picture of the colonel, the Japanese colonel, that he and I went to the Command and General Staff College together. That's interesting, very interesting. Elaine didn't appreciate it, but I thought it was kind of nice.
Do you remember the first American casualty that you saw?
Yeah, I sure do. I had a direct appointment from a sergeant to a second lieutenant, which is rather unusual, as did my wife's brother and my cousin, who became senior vice president of Hayworth and died a couple of years ago. There were, I think, 9 of us out of 9,600 that were commissioned by direct appointment through written and oral examinations. And the question, I'm deviating a little bit. What was the question again?
The first American.
Okay, the first casualty. The first casualty I saw just happened to be a young lieutenant that was commissioned the same day we were. And this was maybe the second day we were in combat. I was, again, leading a patrol around a trail, and there he was, laying off the side of the road. And I'm not going to explain the condition he was in, but that was the first one. And then from then on, every once in a while, you'd run into one or you'd hear about one. You get reports, morning reports, and they'd tell you who got killed and what unit and that sort of thing. But that's the tough part. We had, again, since my brother-in-law and I, got to be my brother-in-law and I were commissioned, your natural tendency is that your enlisted buddies are buddies. But in the military, there's a line of demarcation between being a buddy and being a leader. So they transferred us out of the Holland unit and into Grand Rapids units so we could be away from our direct contact. But there was one particular morning that, for some reason or other, I just walked across the trail, not maybe 100 yards, and chatted with some of my buddies from Holland. I went back to my unit, and within 10 minutes, 12 of them were killed. Just happened to get hit by a Japanese Navy barrage, and I was that close to being there with them. So that's tough. That is really tough.
We got to ask you the question about MacArthur and his wonderful, what he said about you guys after Buna. How did you view MacArthur?
I don't think I'm in a minority. I hope I'm not in a minority. And I don't want to create the impression that I'm a brilliant tactician. But I do think that it's fair for me to say that one of the reasons that her brother and I and others were commissioned lieutenants is that we probably looked at the big picture. That's why we became officers. So I heard a lot of guys complaining about MacArthur when we were in combat, and we were in combat to the point where I think we were down to somewhere around 10% of our original troop strength by the time we were replaced. Now that gives grounds for somebody to complain, no question about it. But I don't think the average person had a clue of why. And the reason why is there was no alternative. And you had to hold the ground with what you had. Therefore, we took a terrible beating physically and in many other ways. I personally, the very first time I heard General MacArthur speak was about a week before he went into combat. I would have gone through a brick wall for that man. No question about it. Then, once I became a casualty, by casualty I mean a malaria casualty, the first experience I had with him was we were outside the combat zone and refresher teaching 81 millimeter mortar, and the Army regulations say that upon a visitation by an inspecting officer, the assistant instructor shall report to the inspector. Now you've heard all about and you've seen all about MacArthur with his flags flying and all that stuff. I just happened to look up and there stood MacArthur leaning up against a tree sucking on his corncob pipe. It wasn't an evidence of anybody else around. So I sent my assistant instructor over there and reported to him like we were supposed to, and he said, just keep doing what you're doing. I just want to see what you're doing. That was the first time. The second time was we were in a casualty area where we were being rehabilitated in New Guinea, and the officers were, needless to say, separated from the enlisted men, and some of us, and I wasn't one of them, but several of the officers bought Australian horses, and this was back in Australia, and we built a corral and we rode horses. The nurses rode horses and we all rode horses. One day MacArthur came showing up. And he was death on booze. He was really death on booze. And would you believe where he met us was in a junction of the officers' quarters, and there was a post there, and right on top of the post is a sign, Bottle Boulevard. I thought, oh boy, we're going to get chewed here. And he looked up and he said, gentlemen, it looks like the morale must be pretty good here. Now, the man had an ego that wouldn't quit. There's no question about it that. But if you analyze why he was what he was and the conditions under which he had to fight with his arm tied behind him, because if you read history in depth, you'll find out that the first team was in Europe. No question. Two reasons. Well, the first reason is obvious, political. Second reason was in terms of distance. The third reason was that right here in this city, you have Polish, you have Jews, you have Catholics, you have Protestants, you have Dutch, and in those days, people could identify with their families. Therefore, their families in the Netherlands or wherever were being punished, therefore we should go help them. No question. But whoever heard of New Guinea? That's part of the problem. The other part of the problem was that professionally, General MacArthur had some buddies that didn't like him too well because he bypassed them in a hurry, getting promoted, and he was, as one person classified him as, the American Caesar. Which, if I have to throw this in. I was invited, Senator Fredericks, the state senator at that time, and I were invited to the 100th anniversary celebration of MacArthur's birthday in Norfolk, Virginia, and we were personal guests of Mrs. MacArthur in a dinner. And Sunday morning, we joined her in the memoirs, the movie, the bio. And we were in the bookstore, and there were two books there, MacArthur, the American Caesar, and MacArthur in his memoirs or something like that. And I said, Mrs. MacArthur, would you sign this for me or autograph it for me? She said, I will that, but not that one. She just despised that other book, The American Caesar. Anyway, I had a close relationship. Other than that, because of my long-term involvement with the military since World War II, it's only natural that I would study the tactics and strategy. And when you think of what the man had to do with, he did a great job. And if you look at his casualty percentages for what the real estate he took, he did a commendable job. I'm not too sure. I wasn't too comfortable with the Truman firing of MacArthur, but at that time I was a student at Command and General Staff College, and some of the faculty were members of MacArthur's staff, and so I shared with them what my personal feeling was, and they said, well, you may feel that way, but you must remember the President of the United States is the President of the United States, and MacArthur was insubordinate, and no doubt about it, he was.
It was 104 before they let them
Well,
move to the back lines, if
I
you will.
took a patrol one day and passed out, and I don't have a clue how I got out. I have no idea how I got back to Port Moresby. All I know is when I came to, which is 100 and some miles away,
Right.
after being loaded on an airplane, I didn't have a clue how it happened. But I do know this, that the very first thing the nurse told me was that I had 105.6. Now
That's almost close to boiling your mind.
that's pretty hot.
Yeah.
And I was wrapped in ice pack and cannon towels.
Wow. Yep. And then we got to ask you a little bit more about Boona. Oh, are we? Did you get a glass of water for? Okay,
That's
good deal.
okay.
All right.
I can get by without, too.
You made it through Boona, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man. Were you ever injured?
That's a joke, because we used to kid some individuals about being recipients of a Purple Heart because they got cut their finger on a can. I was nicked so little on my leg that it wasn't really worth going to the aid station with, so I didn't. I remember one bullet coming by my ear so close that I could feel the heat, but I wasn't hit. So that's a wonderful way to answer the question, because I just wasn't hit. Malaria was all I could handle, and the rest of the diseases that came with it. Malnutrition, that was big.
Part of the problem that we've been reading about was supplies, and the supply drops, and there was always problems with keeping up supplies. How did that affect the men when they weren't getting proper food?
Well, I think the thing that hurt us more than anything else, you heard, I'm sure Gord must have touched this, but when you kick, for example, canned corned beef out of an airplane, and it's flying like such and hits the ground, if they're lucky enough to hit the ground, because sometimes it missed and went down the valley and forget it. But if they happen to hit us, if they bombed us properly, the temperature was such that if you didn't eat it right away, it was going to spoil. And you can about imagine what the conditions of those cans were when it hit. But the thing that bothered us more than anything else, as far as I'm concerned, and did you hear about the rice in the sock or not? Okay, you heard that? Couldn't cook it. You know, that, no fire. That bothered more than anything else, because whatever you did have, you couldn't cook it, you couldn't eat it. And try to eat rice that's soaked in a can all night. It doesn't get very soft. And canned goods, whatever they were, cold is cold, and that's it.
At night in the jungle, what was it like?
Quick swallow of water.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can just set it on the floor right there. If you want.
Okay,
And you can reach for it if you need it.
good. At night,
Yeah, in the jungle, what were your feelings? What was the environment around you like?
well, obviously it's strained because you never know whether they're going to make a night attack or not. The biggest problem was obvious, and that's mosquitoes. I mean, there was no way to avoid them. We did have some spray cans, but we were either wet of rain or wet of sweat, and any spraying you did, it was almost meaningless. we were given specific orders to keep our, well, pants. You've heard this story before, but the only uniform we had was what was on our body, and that's it. But when your hands are bare and your wrists are exposed from your shirt on down, you're pretty raw in the morning when mosquitoes went to work on you. And since the Anopheles mosquito was obviously prevalent, how do you avoid malaria? There's just no way. That is by far the worst. I sent you a picture of this one individual laying on a rack of branches about this high above the water. You just can't comprehend what some of the jungle is like. And I did send you a picture of the individual walking in the mud with the boots. And I mean, once you walked on a trail with 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 people, it's a quagmire in a hurry. So nighttime, that and the uncertainty of what might happen, but you get so fatigued, you get in your little foxhole and you just go to sleep. And there, of course, are exceptions. There are those who had, I remember one specifically, an individual from Coldwater who had a nightmare, and so we threw some sod at him to tell him to shut up, and the next morning he went in there and he was dead. He had had a heart attack and died. We didn't know that. We just tried to shock him out of his hysteria. Can't get away from the rain. There's no way you can get away from the rain, and that's difficult. Can't get away from the hot sun. That's difficult. Humidity is incredible. So nighttime was no relief in the jungle. Along the shore, it was wonderful. In fact, it was wonderful any place along the shore. Always a breeze, wonderful place to be. But that was limited to about 2 miles.
How were orders given and received during the Buna campaign?
Very interesting question. Very interesting question. The reason it's interesting is this. Again, how were we trained? And we were trained to receive orders by message blanks. We were trained to receive orders by arm and hand signals. We were trained to get radio orders. In the jungle, the first instructions we had is take off all your insignia. So if you met somebody, you didn't have a clue what kind of rank they had. The second thing you had to learn is arm and hand signals was suicide. The Japanese, again, being up in these trees more often than not, would see you coming, and all I'd have to do is give a hand signal like that, and they would know I was the leader. So you had to think of almost a whispering campaign. I remember a captain friend of mine who got so paranoid that it was weeks, months after we got out of combat, and he still whispered for fear of being heard. That's pretty much answers your question. You have to learn a whole different means of communication. I'll give you one humorous example. At the time it was pathetic, but it's humorous. We were going into an open field. What I call an open field is 6, 7 feet of grass with a trail down the middle and coconut bunker logs here and there. I knew that because I'd been through there before. If we went around the perimeter, you're in coconut trees, and you don't know from now till then whether you're going to be observed. So you run the chance of running across this open field hid in the grass. And I had a guy ahead of me who, usually when I had a patrol out, you get to know who are the savvy leaders and who are the followers. And you can say, well, you the lieutenant, why weren't you up front? Well, you can't have complete control up front. On the other hand, you don't want to be the coward and be the last one. So you have to compromise. And I generally compromised by being the second or third one from the front. I would brief them before we went, and this is what you can expect, if I knew what we were going to expect. In certain areas, I'd been through it often enough where I knew what to expect. This one individual, I don't know how I could get through to that guy and make him listen. So I said, now, when you get in that trail, you're going to see a great big coconut log across the trail. I said, don't go over it, go around it. Because if they see you go over it, they're going to shoot you. Would you believe he went over and he got him right in the rear? Well, I said, now do you understand what I was talking about? And that's training the hard way, but I tried to prevent that by telling him in advance what was going to happen. That's one way of leadership. But arm and hand signals, if you look at the mortality rate of second lieutenants, you're going to find that it's percentage-wise very high. And the reason is you're so trained, arm and hand signals, to lead that it's almost a given. You know, how do you communicate without doing it? If you turn around and talk, you're a dead duck. So you have to figure out other ways.
This is the very personal question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Were you a man of faith before you
Oh,
came
absolutely.
to New Guinea? Did that
Absolutely.
change?
Strengthened. There's a correlation there that I think has some bearing. It just so happens that the night before my 22nd birthday, which happened to be Thanksgiving Day, so we're coming up on that soon, this now brother-in-law became my brother-in-law, at that time my buddy, who was a second lieutenant, machine gunner. He said to me, when we get back to Holland, what are you going to do? And I said, number one, I'm going to buy a sailboat. Number two, I'm going to contribute to the community to the best of my ability. I'm 21 years old now. That night, I was selected to run the first night patrol on the San Hernando Trail. Day patrols was suicide. Night patrols was unheard of. But for some reason or other, that's what the old man decided he wanted done. So I went up to the battalion commander. It happened to be, at that time, Major George Bond out of Adrian, Michigan, and my company commander and the chaplain. And I emptied my pockets and I handed everything to the chaplain. And I said, Chaplain, if I don't come back, send this to my mother. I guess that is something that you just cannot forget. The next day, her brother was clobbered with a mortar shell. I survived that day for a couple, well, I don't know, faith, obviously. You know, and therein lies a real question of theology. Her brother was killed in Anzio, but if it hadn't been the fact that her brother was wounded overseas, I probably wouldn't end up with his sister. So, you know, you look at faith so many ways. Temporary conversions, I saw lots of that. We all saw lots of that in combat. But faith ran real silent and deep in the individual. You could just tell by their behavior and their demeanor how comfortable they were in what was going on. Did I send you a copy of that diary of this lieutenant that died? And I've got one with me that you should have.
Yeah.
This is a friend of mine. He was a 27-year-old lieutenant at the time out of I Company, which is a Grand Rapids unit, but he was a reserve officer. Now, you understand, one of the things you're going to end up with on this interview is the differences, communication being one, evacuation being another. Here's a man who was wounded by the Japanese. We could hear him holler for help. Someone sent a captain, a lieutenant, and a medic, and someone else, sergeant at the Grand Rapids, all killed trying to save a lieutenant. So the order came out, no more. Not too long after that, I was sent out on patrol, and on the way back, I just decided on my own, I'm going to check to see if I can find Lieutenant Horton. Well, I found Lieutenant Horton, but he had died. And he wrote a diary while he was dying, and it's awesome, and I have it here. But the next to last paragraph says something like this: I have a pistol with me, I could kill myself, but for some reason or other, I don't think God has that plan for me. And then he said, I now know how Christ fell on the cross. You know, this is pretty heavy stuff. And anyway, I did find him, and I did take his personal effects and did turn it into the next higher command, and it's now history. But we had a lot of that sort of thing.
One quick question for you. Since you were a commanding officer, when you came back to West Michigan, did you visit any of the families of the men who had died over in the South Pat?
I did, and man, I should go here, but I don't know when you want to cut this off. I'm morally compelled to tell you the story, and then if you want to follow through at a different interview, that's fine. One of the men that left us in Louisiana, and I think I alluded to that earlier, from Zealand, a wonderful friend of mine, I talked to about before we start taping, ended up as a prisoner of war in Tunisia, spent 2.5 years in Japan, in Germany as a prisoner of war. When I came home from overseas, his mother called me and said, would you go visit John at Percy Jones Hospital? And by this time, he was a captain. And he's sitting on the floor in a hallway at Percy Jones Hospital in a robe, staring off into space. And I stuck out my hand to shake hands with him, and he jerked his hand back and he said, Bill, for some reason or other, I have an aversion to shaking hands. And his family was thrilled because that's the first time he had talked. And since then, he had shock treatments and all that sort of thing, and he eventually regained his, but there's a part of his life that's completely gone. But he ended up with a Doctor of Divinity degree out of Duke University and had a wonderful family and a wonderful career, and he just finished his book about 2 weeks ago and sent me a copy with honors. That's one. And others, naturally, there were 2 brothers killed on one day out of our outfit. And naturally, I went to see that family and others, naturally.
Tell us what kind of diseases you had besides malaria.
We started off with amoebic dysentery. That, needless to say, weakened us to start with. And then over the mountains, and then malaria. Tropical ulcers, which is external, legs. Typhus. Hookworm. Ringworm. I don't know what else is there. Jaundice. I've never gotten a straight answer on that one. We ran out of quinine because the Japanese had gotten hold of it in Java. And so when we ran out of quinine, we had to have something. And right about that time, they came up with a formula called Adabrin that you've probably heard about. And we are convinced one of 2 things. Either the product hadn't been field tested enough, or there was rumors now that it had been sabotaged. But we start taking that, and 2 things happened. Number one, we became yellow as you could be jaundiced, really jaundiced. And whether that was a byproduct of the yellow tablet or what, I don't have any idea to this day. I do know that they've certainly improved the technique of controlling malaria since that time. Interesting aside here, as I've shared with you before, our campaign, the first campaign had 83% malaria casualties. The second campaign, which is the ITOPI campaign, someone conceived the brilliant idea of going over with bombers first and spraying with oil and DDT. They reduced the incidence, now I'm talking fresh replacement troops, down to 6%. The third, I think it was WEWAC somewhere, the third down to half of 1%, just by going over a zone before and killing off the mosquitoes and then going in. So nothing, I don't think that anything compares with malaria, because I never realized how serious it was until first of all, I discovered my own personal malaria record here about 6 months ago, and I didn't realize I had spent that many days in the hospital. But when you consider the percentage of in foreign countries today, this day who die because of malaria, it's unbelievable.
Mm-hmm. In terms of injuries and sickness, how were people medically evacuated?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm glad you asked it, because today's mindset is helicopters, gunships, medevac, all that stuff. We didn't even have a Jeep. We had nothing except hand carry. And by hand carry, I mean until we were well into the campaign, when we finally did get a Jeep that was brought in with an airplane, we had a hand carry. Well, Elaine's brother, for example, was wounded. He was operated on in a thatched roof hut with mud floor and no windows, a flashlight for surgery, and carried 6 miles back to another hospital out in the open field, which was bombed, incidentally, and eventually over the mountains into New Guinea. So most of our medevac was hand carry, plasma was almost unheard of, so the mortality rate compared to today in combat was very high.
Now we're going to totally change here. We just have about 5 minutes left, I think Gordon said. Who was there to meet you when you came home to Holland?
Well, my dad died a week before I went overseas, so needless to say, the very first thing I did was check in with my mother, because I was the oldest of 5 kids, and I had a brother yet who was in the Air Force at the time. And then the second thing I did was run over to see my buddy's family, which is a few blocks away. Greet us when we came under the San Francisco Bridge, and we pulled into the dock. The band was playing, and of course that was fabulous. And other than that, I was a troop commander of a train from San Francisco to Fort Sheridan, Illinois. And so we were not a unit, we were all individuals on that train, and eventually we went our various ways from Fort Sheridan, Illinois home. And obviously my mother and sisters and my younger brother were happy to see me, and as were my grandpa and grandma and the rest. And my wife's mother and dad, because I'd been friends with the family forever, and so that was all good homecoming. And the people from my church were happy because I was one of the very first people that left our church to go on active duty. And so after 5 years, that's quite a while.
One quick question. You said you wanted to buy a sailboat when you
Yeah.
returned, and that you wanted to contribute to your community when you returned.
Well,
How
it took
did
me
you do those?
took me some 20 years to get the sailboat, but I did join the Chamber of Commerce. I did join the Salvation Army Advisory Board. In fact, I'm a life member, still am. I did get involved in the community affairs through the chamber, and eventually Kiwanis Club in leadership there, and eventually someone came up with a bright idea that maybe I ought to be run for mayor, and that happened. And once I was made U.S. history by being defeated by the youngster fresh out of college, we moved into Allegan County, and I became a county commissioner, and I was that for 10 years. So I guess I lived up to my promise that I would make a commitment to my community.
We only have a few minutes left, so April, do you have a last question?
Just in a couple sentences, how would you sum up your experiences in the Pacific?
Well, the most difficult thing was time and distance. We couldn't even tell our families where we were. Some were in the South Pacific, and that's pretty general. So when your family reads about what's going on in the Pacific, they can come to all kinds of assumptions, but they don't have a clue whether you're in New Guinea or Guadalcanal or where you are, as compared to today, where with videos and we have a grandson who is a Calvin student, and he's sending us communication through his, what do you call it, the keyboard? Laptop computer. That's the most difficult thing. Worrying about the people back home, and they're worrying about you, and you're not getting your mail for 30 days, and so you're disconnected from the world.